The KV tank symbolized the iron will of communist Russia to outproduce, out-armor and outgun the capitalist West during the Second World War. It proved its worth in the war against Finland, and by 1941 it was the most powerful tank in the world. The KV's robust design even forced German designers to come up with a tank strong enough to take it on. By 1945, it had evolved from a brutal fighting machine to a war-winning weapon. In the first half of the 20th century, Russia transformed from a rural backwater into an industrial colossus, which by 1941 had produced the world's most indestructible tank. By the end of the Second World War, it had produced more tanks than Germany and the United States put together. But Russia was a relative latecomer to tank design and production.
The Russians had no experience of tank warfare in the First World War. The Eastern Front, wide open spaces, massed cavalry was effective on the Eastern Front, which it never could be on the Western Front. So there was really no push towards mechanization on the Eastern Front. First time the Russians come up against tanks in any number is during the Russian Civil War, 1919 onwards, when the Bolsheviks, who've seized power in 1917, are fighting the White Russians, a mixture of Mensheviks and monarchists. Now the British, the French and the Americans are supporting the White Russians, and they supply them with a number of tanks. The Bolsheviks capture some of them and use them. Now tanks were not crucial in the Russian Civil War. They really had very little effect. Armoured cars and armoured trains were far more important than tanks, but the idea was sown.
But there's clearly a division here between Russian military professionals and those informed by Marxist-Leninist ideology. And many of those informed by Marxist-Leninist ideology who had served with the 1st Cavalry Army, who were loyal to Stalin in his struggle with Trotsky, people like Budeny and Voroshilov, are people who are very much wedded to the idea still of cavalry and mass infantry assault, rather than use and application of armour.
During the 1920s, Russia's military thinkers set about studying tactical maneuvers in great depth. By analysing various military engagements, such as the Great War, they planned to outline how a war might be waged in the future. Their thinking led to the development of a theory which eventually became known as deep battle.
The Russians accepted that whatever form future war might take, it would involve wide open spaces. The deep battle concept, which was the Russian idea of what future war might be, was not dissimilar to Little Hart's idea of the expanding torrent in England, or the German version, which was blitzkrieg. Essentially, they are all the same. What the Russians thought was that you would need a tank of some sort, probably a heavy tank, to support the infantry and create breaches in the enemy defences, and then you would need a medium tank or a light tank to exploit those breaches. What you would do is you would break through enemy defences, you would drive deep into enemy territory, and then you would carve up your enemy.
So it's a very offensive concept. It's a way of breaking down the trench lines of the First World War. The Russians like it because they want to fight an offensive war and because they believe in independent mobile operations of the kind that cavalry used in the Civil War, and because they are very keen on motor cars and vehicles of all kinds. So these things all come together. And so in the early 1930s, Tukhachevsky, who's the head of materiel for the Red Army, becomes the main advocate of the deep battle concept. And it's really adopted in 1932-33 as the main doctrine of the Red Army.
The Soviets knew that in order to defeat a capitalist coalition, they would need to modernize and equip their army with weapons and armor far superior to those of their enemy. But Russia lacked the industry to equip a 20th century army. Stalin soon found a radical solution to this problem. In 1928, Stalin introduced a drastic program to kickstart production. It was industrialization at a speed never witnessed nor attempted before.
Russia was defeated in the 1914 to 1918 war because it was backward. It was defeated in lots of other wars because it was backward and trying to catch up with other states. And Stalin's whole idea in the 30s is that Russia won't be backward anymore and it will have modern armed forces. He's not alone in that, because Russian governments, really from the time of Peter the Great, have been trying to catch up with the West and carry forward state-sponsored modernization for military goals.
Stalin planned to use his position as leader to impose a harsh program of industrialization. This would mean taking money away from his people and injecting it into his meager army, so improving military output. Called the 5-year plan, this project would allow Russia the opportunity to modernize its army and eventually surpass the capitalist West. As the 1930s beckoned, Russia stood on the brink of an industrial campaign of modernization, the likes of which the world had never seen before. Whilst effectively starving his own people, Stalin poured money into the development and production of military hardware.
In 1927 to 1932, Stalin carries out the first 5-year plan. And this first 5-year plan is about industrialization, it's about steel mills, it's about importing technology, it's about building tractors, it's about building cars and other kinds of vehicles, it's about building aircraft. It's also very much geared towards national defense. And when Stalin is trying to sell the idea of industrialization and to sell the idea of the fast pace of industrialization, he justifies it on the grounds of economic modernization of the military.
Stalin has this very, very strong view of socialism in one country, the idea that capitalist countries are out to destroy the Soviet Union and this alternative Marxist-Leninist vision. And so that's clearly something that informs the ideologues and Stalin himself in terms of how he reacts in relation to Western powers. There's no question about that. And I think armour plays a part in all of this, and it's certainly something which concerns the Soviet Union in terms of making sure that it has got a large armoured force.
In 1931, an enormous tank-building program was launched. Over the years that followed, a number of heavy tanks were produced as Soviet designers experimented with different features. The main heavy tank that emerged from Russia during the 1930s was the T-26. A number were sent to Spain to help the Republican cause. It was a baptism of fire, and the experience marked a turning point for Russian tank evolution.
The Spanish Civil War had a large impact on Soviet armoured vehicle development. It was here that they came up against the Germans for the first time. Their tanks were exposed to high-velocity anti-tank fire, first of all from the small 37mm anti-tank gun, but increasingly towards the end of the conflict, the Germans, the Condor Legion, started using the 88mm gun as an anti-tank weapon. As a result of this, the Russians soon realised that they would have to dramatically up-armour and up-arm their vehicles. And this started a race which they took far more seriously, in fact, than the Germans did.
So as a result of the experience of being in Spain, tactically, the Russians learn important lessons. They have better armored tanks, and they go for the diesel engine as a more reliable power source. So you have a kind of paradox. On the one hand, the kind of operational lesson is the wrong one, that you can't use tanks independently. But technically, they do produce better tanks as a result of what they learned in Spain.
But while Russian tanks were being put through their paces in Spain, Stalin embarked on an 18-month campaign of terror that later became known as the purges. The stronger the Red Army grew, the more Stalin suspected it of harbouring Tsarist sympathizers who were plotting to overthrow him. So Stalin drafted a list of supposed enemies and had them killed or sent to concentration camps. The effect on the Red Army was devastating.
3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union are made to disappear. And of the corps commanders, these are lieutenant generals and generals, 75 out of 85 of those senior officers are eliminated in really effectively 12 to 18 months. At a divisional level, over half of the divisional commanders are also essentially killed or in some cases placed in gulags. Some of those officers actually are going to be resurrected, of course, once the war with Germany begins, and they are actually going to reappear again in 1941 and 1942, but not before, as I say, over half of the divisional officers are killed, 75 out of 85 of the corps commanders, and 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union.
Those that are left, from all levels, from general down to second lieutenant, are very careful about taking a decision themselves. They're very careful about using their initiative. They're very, very careful about doing anything that might draw the unfavourable attention of the Commissar and the party upon them. So, in a sense, it stultifies the Russian army. It brings their professional standards way down, and they suffered for it in 1941.
Stalin's paranoia and subsequent purges had caused great damage to the structure of his army and power base. As a result, he was left with a massive armed force, but little military intelligence or confidence to back it up. By the end of the 1930s, Russian designers were experimenting with a number of heavy tank designs. The experience of Soviet tanks in the Spanish Civil War had clearly demonstrated the weakness of their armour against German 37mm anti-tank guns. So in 1937, the Directorate of Armed Forces issued a new specification. Further heavy tanks would have to be sufficiently armoured to withstand fire from a 76.2mm gun and be powered by a diesel engine. Several models were produced, one of which was the KV. The KV was named after Klimenti Voroshilov, the Soviet People's Commissar for Defense. It had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 76.2mm gun with 3 7.62mm machine guns. Its armour was up to 106mm thick. The KV was powered by a V2 diesel engine capable of 500 brake horsepower, a range of 225 kilometres and a top road speed of 35 kilometres per hour.
The tank was 46 tons, quite heavy, and one of the drawbacks already was at the time that it couldn't keep up with the T-34s, and that was a setback to it. It had, however, quite a few advanced things incorporated, like the torsion bar suspension, and also had a compressed air starter. But in general, it was a bit long for its design, and the steering was rather primitive and gave often trouble. That was its weakest link, really, the steering system.
Despite its low speed, the KV-1 used its workhorse V2 diesel engine to great effect.
The V2 was an excellent engine. It was simple, it was easy to maintain, and it had the great benefit of being diesel, which meant that it was much easier to start in the cold Russian winters. Less problems with ignition, less problems with damp. But when you think about it, that engine didn't really change very much. Right up until the late 60s, the Russians were still using essentially that same engine on all their tanks.
By the late 1930s, Stalin had become increasingly worried that Russia would be invaded from the West. This fear was intensified by the fact that Leningrad, with its population of 3.5 million, was just 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. Stalin approached the Finnish government with requests, including one to build a naval base, all of which were refused. So in November 1939, he ordered the invasion of Finland. On paper, the Red Army had an enormous advantage, outnumbering the small Finnish force by more than 5 to 1. It was backed up by over 1,500 tanks, a number of which were KVs. Yet the campaign turned into a complete disaster for Russia.
The war in Finland is a rather strange war because it isn't really suited for the kind of independent operations which deep battle takes into account. It's much more like the First World War than anything that will come later on. And in particular, there's a problem of getting through the Mannerheim line, which is the line of Finnish field fortifications between Leningrad and Finland. It's very hard to break through those lines. They've got mines, they've got anti-tank guns, they've got concrete pillboxes, and so on. And so, in a way, the KV is suited for that more than it is suited for operations in the open steppes of Ukraine or even in Belarusia, because it's a relatively slow tank, but a very heavily armored one.
In order to successfully overrun the Finnish fortifications, the Soviets knew their attack would need to be well concentrated and executed perfectly. However, the effect of Stalin's purges on the Red Army was also starting to show. Men were poorly trained, and most of their tanks were not equipped to deal with the anti-tank guns and minefields of the Mannerheim line. That is, except for one.
Now, the KV tank is going to be one of the few success stories in relation to this war against Finland, in the sense that it is very, very effective against destroying Finnish entrenched positions and Finnish bunkers, and does have a significant impact upon the battle. But it's literally about the only Soviet success story in relation to this conflict. And in fact, the Russians lose extensively in this conflict. They lose hundreds of tanks, literally hundreds of tanks. Their air power is ineffective because, of course, much of this fighting is north of the Arctic Circle, and of course so much of the time it's dark because it's north of the Arctic Circle, and so therefore air power can't be deployed. And the Finns, using ski troops, are extremely mobile, very, very effective and well led under Mannerheim, and put up a very, very good fight, really.
Despite the Finns' fierce resistance, the Red Army broke through the Mannerheim line in February 1940. Although the KV had contributed to this success, its performance in battle had also highlighted a number of faults. Besides needing another crew member to take the pressure off the commander, the KV needed a larger gun that could blast open bunkers. But mounting a bigger gun meant enlarging the turret, so the KV-1 was adapted. The resulting tank was called the KV-2, but was named Dreadnought by its crews.
Leading on from the KV-1, we have the development of a new high silhouette tank called the KV-2. Now, this was to be a real attempt at mounting a large gun on a tank chassis. And initially they start with a 122mm, but that quickly is upgraded to a 155mm gun, which they mount on the KV-2. Now, mounting this kind of gun on the same chassis as a KV-1 obviously meant that the actual tank, the whole balance of the tank, the whole centre of gravity of the tank, and the actual weight of the tank were all dramatically altered.
The addition of a larger gun totally changed the shape of the KV. It could accommodate a 6-man crew. Its main gun was increased to a 152mm howitzer, alongside which were mounted two 7.62mm machine guns. It shared its predecessor's V2 diesel engine and 600 brake horsepower. The KV-2 had a range of 200 kilometers and could hit a top road speed of 26 kilometers per hour. The KV's real baptism of fire came in 1941. Despite signing a non-aggression pact, Hitler did not trust Stalin and decided to launch a preemptive strike. Codenamed Operation Barbarossa, Hitler launched his most ambitious attack of the Second World War. To defeat the Red Army, Germany sent a force of over 3 million men, backed up by hundreds of thousands of armoured vehicles, horses and aircraft. Their aims were to capture Leningrad, Moscow and Kiev. The main German battle tanks were the Panzer Marks III and IV, but despite this show of strength, Hitler did not expect a struggle. His panzers had demolished every Allied tank in their path, and he believed that Russia, an inferior nation, was simply unable to produce anything to match German technology. As it awaited the arrival of the German force, the Red Army deployed the KV and its main medium tank, the T-34. When German troops met both tanks, their shock was palpable.
When the Germans initially met the KV, there was consternation, in some cases panic even. The Germans find here's this huge tank rumbling along, or perhaps not even rumbling along, perhaps just staying still at a crossroads. And however much they fire at it, they can't do it. It has absolutely no effect. Everything bounces off. There are instances of a KV driving rather slowly through the serried ranks of German tanks, and nobody can do anything about it. And the only way they can take it out is by about turning, driving alongside it, and getting it up the rear. So it certainly worries them initially.
So what message they get, the Germans, in June, July 1941, is not that the Russians have a very mobile tank or a very good all-purpose tank, which is the T-34. What they learn is that the Russians have a very heavily armored tank, which is the KV, and that tank cannot be the armor can't be penetrated by the 37mm anti-tank gun, or by the 50mm anti-tank gun, or by any tank gun carried by German tanks of the time.
The Germans quickly realized there were few ways to successfully attack and destroy a KV tank. One way was simply to outnumber it, overpower it with firepower from all sides. The other, more reliable method was to use an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. But even then, artillery troops would need to erect and aim the gun first, an extremely time-consuming maneuver during the heat of battle. So the KV prompted the German army to step back, to realize the limitations of their own tanks, and to create something to match it. By 1942, Hitler's army had pushed well into Russia, seizing towns, villages and cities. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners had been captured, and countless numbers had died in combat. But the battle raged on. Hitler thought that the defeat of the Red Army was possible, but dependent on a steady, relentless onward march. He knew his army did not have time to get bogged down in battle, and that to fail in the north of Russia would also mean failure in the south. But the sheer robustness of the Russian KV tank had become a painful thorn in the Führer's side. German troops reported again and again of how the KV tank had prevented their advance, and of their frustrating inability to effectively destroy it. But perhaps the Germans should have recognized the Russian threat earlier. Back in the late 1930s, the two powers had sustained an uneasy partnership. After expressing their mutual desire to control Poland, they had worked together closely to discuss the possibility of eventually dividing it up between them. Both countries had been privy to one another's affairs, as well as to one another's military capabilities.
It is said that during that very artificial German-Soviet alliance, cobbled together by Ribbentrop to allow them to divide Poland between them, that a Russian armoured delegation visited German tank factories and were shown the Mark IV. And they said to the Germans, yes, don't you have anything bigger than that? The Germans said no, because they hadn't. And the Russians believed that something was being hidden from them. The Germans surely must have something bigger than the Mark IV. The Russians, of course, knowing that they had the KV and the T-34 under development, both of which were considerably bigger, or would be, than the Mark IV.
The KV was not only shell-proof, but it could overcome virtually any obstacle. Once the Germans discovered the KV's power, their consternation turned into outright panic. Hitler's plan to secure Moscow before the onset of winter was fading fast, and as more and more KVs got in their way, the progress of the German army became unbearably slow. The bitterly cold weather soon kicked in. The German army was not prepared for a winter war. Panzers continually broke down as they could not deal with the mud and snow, and their dependence on petrol meant that their engines wouldn't start in the plunging temperatures. There was no antifreeze, their weapons wouldn't work, and there were not even enough supplies to clothe and feed German soldiers. These problems delayed the march on Moscow and allowed the Soviets enough time to call up reinforcements to defend the capital. However, the situation remained precarious for the Red Army. As new tank divisions were employed to defend the front line, Soviet commanders became increasingly aware that their tank crews were extremely inefficient and unable to control their own vehicles effectively. Thanks to Stalin's infamous purges years earlier, there was no longer a coherent training regime or anyone with enough knowledge and experience to train new recruits.
Having built up this tremendous doctrine, the whole operational art concept, the ability to carry it out, the necessary training, the training base of trained officers was wiped out. So it was in many respects all for nothing, and all that was left really was the tanks.
At a sort of NCO level and at a sort of level of a basic level, if you like, the training was no more than in some cases an hour on tanks. And so you were expected to be able to drive a KV tank or a T-34 tank perhaps after 1 hour's instruction. And so this clearly was not very effective. You'd been drafted in from the infantry or the cavalry on that basis. In terms of the junior grade officers, in terms of the second lieutenants and lieutenants, many of them also had no real training in the operation of tanks in terms of how tanks should operate on the battlefield, either individually or collectively. And so in terms of crew training, there is a real problem in terms of Soviet armour, really right up until the end of 1942.
Despite the inefficiency of Soviet tank crews, Moscow had been saved from occupation, at least for the time being. But north of Moscow, another calamity beckoned. By the end of 1941, Leningrad had become encircled by German forces. Its imminent invasion caused anxiety amongst the Russian hierarchy, not only from a territorial standpoint, but also because Leningrad was home to KV tank production. For Stalin, it was time to think the unthinkable.
In a way, the most dangerous moment for the Russians comes in the autumn and winter of 1941 and early 42, when the tank plants are being moved back into Siberia and into the Urals. And it's not really until the spring of 42 that production picks up again. So how do the Russians survive when they can't actually build tanks for about 6 to 9 months?
Russia remained defiant in the face of German adversity. Although he would have to do without a steady stream of new KV tanks, Stalin knew that at some point his factories would still have to produce a surplus to help sustain tank numbers during the break. On top of all this, by mid-1942, the tank's design faults were really beginning to surface.
The KV-2, although an awesome sight on the battlefield, was limited in several critical ways. For example, the ball bearings that operated on the turrets actually were not effective at dealing with this kind of gun and the weight of this gun. And in fact, the gun, although it could traverse 360 degrees, it could only do that when the tank was stationary and when it was also on flat terrain. And so basically, although it is a very impressive weapon, it does have serious limitations. It does have this very, very powerful gun, but it's a gun which cannot be used effectively on the battlefield. You know, you have to stop to actually fire the weapon.
It's amazing how the Russians, whom we praised up all the while now, with the T-34, got the idea of putting out the KV-2, which of course was the chassis of the KV-1 and had a big steel box on top, like a rabbit's hatch, with a hefty 15.2mm gun in there. Again, for bunker busting things meant, I suppose. But even the Russians got fed up with it because there was no way of camouflaging it in any position. You see, it was so big and cumbersome, they just didn't like it anymore. You couldn't miss it, you see, even if you shot at it. It must belong to the sort of school in the Russian army hierarchy that everything big must be good, you see.
After narrowly failing to conquer Russia in 1941, Hitler had to reassess his options. He could not afford to mount another attack on nearly the same scale, but he was not willing to remain on the defensive and consolidate his gains. As 1942 wore on, the Red Army began to hit back with a vengeance, inflicting huge defeats on the Germans at Stalingrad and at the gates of the Caucasus. These defeats severely dented the German army's belief in its own invincibility. But the German army was far from beaten. A brutal counterattack in the summer of 1942 was enough to remind Stalin that the war was not lost. Worse still, it marked a turning point for the KV.
The real swan song of the KV is the Battle of Kharkov in the summer of 1942, and they used KVs in quite large quantities, and it's a Russian disaster. And really from that time, I think the Russians realized that the KV is too awkward to be used effectively as a battle tank. One of the problems with the KVs is quite slow. It's also a very heavy tank. So, you know, it may seem like an obvious problem, but you can't get through a bridge with a 45-ton tank. You'll destroy the bridge as you go over it. And it's very hard to operate T-34s and KVs together because the KV is slower and it destroys the bridges. So in the end, what the Russians go for is all T-34 formations without very many KVs.
There was one other source of hope for the German army. It finally had an answer to the KV.
In 1941, the Germans are astonished by how good the Russian tanks are. And the KV, the T-34 are mechanically much better than any German tank. They're not operated as well, but in terms of their gun and their armor, their mobility, they are better than the German tanks. Between June of 41 and the summer of 43, the Germans make every attempt to match the Russians in terms of quality, if not of quantity. So they're trying to have tanks that are as good as the KV. So they build the Tiger to really have the same kind of armor as the KV, and with a gun that can penetrate the armor of either the T-34 or the KV. It's an 88mm high-velocity gun. It's ideal for knocking out other tanks.
The Tiger tank was more than a fitting match for the Russian KV. But at Kursk, the Axis forces discovered they could not compete with the sheer number of Russian tanks on the battlefield. The original plan had been straightforward enough. By July 1943, Hitler had recognized that a large Soviet salient had formed around the city of Kursk. This salient was creating a bulge in the German front, nearly 200 kilometers wide and over 75 kilometers long. The bulk of the Red Army was stationed in this bulge. For Hitler, it was too good an opportunity to miss. He ordered his army to crush the salient and to put all Tigers into battle. This was, however, against the advice of his generals, who had argued that there were not nearly enough Tiger tanks to ensure decisive success. Nevertheless, in what became one of the biggest set-piece battles in history, and the largest tank engagement of the war, Soviet tank crews came face to face with the Tiger. Hitler took a big gamble at Kursk and lost heavily. It extinguished any hopes he had of securing victory in the east. But this loss could not be entirely blamed on the ratio of tank numbers in the field. The Soviet army's triumph at Kursk had also been the result of a quiet revolution that had been taking place within the Red Army. By mid-1943, it was a different Soviet force to the one that struggled against the German tidal wave in 1941. Stalin had been compelled to reorganize his troops following the humiliating performance of his army in 1941. He had replaced his circle of sycophants with honest generals, and the role of the commissar had been downgraded so that soldiers would start to use their own initiative again. Nepotism had, at last, been replaced by a meritocracy. The Red Army's motorized divisions had also been reorganized along German lines, with the T-34 leading the way as the Soviet tank of choice.
As time goes on, the KV becomes less and less relevant. It becomes less and less relevant for two reasons. First of all, once the tide of the war on the Eastern Front shifts and the Russians are no longer on the defensive, then for offensive work, the KV is not the ideal tank. Nevertheless, they keep producing them because the assembly lines are there. It is still useful. They do upgrade it as time goes on. They up-armor it. It's the same tank, but they improve it. Eventually, of course, they get to the point where there's been so much extra armor put on it that it can no longer work with the T-34. So it is then put into separate units. But the Russians are still thinking in terms of heavy tank. Eventually, the Joseph Stalin heavy tank comes on stream. That then becomes the latest, the modern Russian heavy tank. But essentially, it's a KV. It's just a better KV, better armour, better transmission, better gun, better turret. But it's a spin-off from the KV.
The changing tide of the war and the threat of the Tiger tank spurred Soviet designers to come up with an upgraded version of the KV, and in 1944 it emerged. It was called the IS, after Stalin himself, and it evolved steadily to become the tank that finally liberated Russia.
First of all, there was the KV-85, which put in the new 85mm gun in a modified turret. That was an incremental step that was needed to address particular shortcomings. However, a redesign was also undertaken, and basically the automotive parts of the KV design and the chassis became the basis for the IS-1 and the IS-2 tanks.
Development of the IS tank series had only started in 1942. But due to the impressive performance of the Tiger tanks during the Kursk battle, Soviet officials decided to push their new tank into general production much earlier than initially planned. Just 1 year later, the first IS tanks were rolling off the production line. Various versions of the tank were tried and tested until eventually the IS-2 emerged. By 1944, the IS-2 was in general production and had become a staple ingredient in the Red Army's arsenal. It worked well to symbolize Russia's evolution in the tank development process and served as a fitting statement of strength against the dying Nazi dream. Well-armored, mounting an enormous gun, it was extremely reliable and spearheaded the victorious Soviet push towards Berlin. The IS-2 was one of the most powerful tanks to emerge during the Second World War. It had a 4-man crew. The IS-2's enlarged turret housed a 122mm gun, the largest gun ever to be mounted on a tank during World War II. Its armour was up to 160mm thick. Using the tried and tested V2 engine, the IS-2 had a range of 150 kilometres, and it could hit a top speed of 37 kilometres per hour. At the end of 1943, Allied leaders Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt met up in the Middle East to discuss plans to launch a major offensive against Germany in the coming year. It was decided that Churchill and Roosevelt would lead an Allied offensive from the western coast of Europe. Codenamed Operation Overlord, the aim of the attack would be to force the Axis army eastwards, back into the very heartland of Germany. Similarly, Stalin promised to launch his own offensive to coincide with the Allied invasion. Operation Bagration, as it was known, was eventually launched on the 22nd of June 1944, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of Russia. The armed force consisted of 1,700,000 Soviet troops, supported by 6,000 aircraft, 24,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 tanks. The attack destroyed Army Group Center, releasing Moscow from the Axis grip, and became the most disastrous defeat suffered by Germany in the entire war. It cost the Wehrmacht more men and material than their notorious rout at Stalingrad, and it was the IS tank that helped inflict this punishing defeat.
Operation Bagration begins in June of 1944. Now, this operation was meant to coincide with the Normandy landings on 6th of June 1944. In reality, the ever-cautious Stalin held those operations back for a couple of weeks just to see how the Allies were going to get on in Normandy before he actually committed his forces. But towards the end of June, they do launch this massive series of offensives, in fact 9 separate offensives, with the massive use of armour, Russian heavy tanks, with great dramatic effect. And Bagration actually is going to have a huge success in the late summer and autumn of 1944, effectively liberating most of the Soviet Union and really driving the whole of the German army back to Eastern European boundaries.
History tells us how the German forces were eventually defeated by the Allies, and how Russia chased its fleeing enemy all the way back to Berlin, where the Third Reich was destroyed in May 1945. Following Hitler's death and the subsequent dissection of the German capital, the career of the IS tank continued to flourish. In an ironic twist, the very same tank that had helped the Russians to defeat Nazi Germany became the machine that would threaten the capitalist West during the Cold War. Although it eventually became known as the T-10, the tank remained in service for Russia until the late 1960s. The KV was one of Russia's longest-serving tanks of the Second World War. When it was designed in 1939, the KV was the most advanced heavy tank in the world. It emerged as a valuable battle tank during the notorious Finland campaign and proved its worth when it halted the German advance at the gates of Moscow. But by mid-1943 it had become a liability, and its German rival was starting to pose a real threat to the Red Army. Undeterred, Soviet designers saw an opportunity to transform the KV into the tank that would ultimately push Hitler's army back to Berlin.
The KV-1 could go through anything, and it terrified and demoralised the Germans. The only problem was the KVs weren't available in large enough numbers. They were difficult to deploy, they were difficult to get across bridges and things like this because they were so big and heavy.
Although the engine is excellent, there are huge problems with the transmission. To change gear, you had to stop the tank. So although it was quite fast, you very rarely actually achieved its highest speed.
The KV suffered because it was compared with really a first-rate tank in the form of the T-34. The KV wasn't as fast, it was more awkward, it didn't have a better gun, it didn't have a better motor, it wasn't any easier to use tactically. But it was still, by the standards of the time, much better than any comparable German or British tank in 1941.